Hello and welcome back to the Resistance podcast. Today I'm joined by the esteemed Doctor of King's College London, Dr. Heiko Khoo. Heiko, who are you? Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm a 60-year-old, born in London. My mother's German, father's Chinese, grew up in the suburbs of London. And I've been involved in Marxist politics and thought since I was 17 years of age. And I've been speaking at Speaker's Corner, promoting the ideas I believe in since the end of 1985. I've done journalistic work. I've done research. I've done a bit of teaching and stuff like that as well. But now my main job is doing the Karl Marx walking tour. But as the election's just been announced, and I used to be a Labour Party member for my sins, supporting the idea, supporting Jeremy Corbyn's team and also other sort of left groups in the Labour Party in the past. I decided to join the Workers' Party after the election of George Galloway, and I'm standing in the election on the 4th of July.
So you are a candidate for the Workers' Party, but people will probably recognise your name. They will probably recognise your voice. Where have people seen you before?
Speaker's Corner or on the anti-lockdown protests. That would have been the most prominent protests I was involved in.
You run speakerscorner.net?
Speakerscorner.net is a sort of latent website that has some information about Speaker's Corner. But I was involved quite heavily from the summer of 2020 in the anti-lockdown protests, joined all sorts of different activities, and we did a number of activities together.
So I want to start with just a little bit about your background, because it seems like you moved through the core of some world events. And I've interviewed you before a little bit about when you were young, when you were a student, was it? You were actually in Tiananmen Square.
Yeah, I was involved in what was called the Militant Tendency. So the Militant Tendency was a group inside the Labour Party, sort of revolutionary group inside the Labour Party or inside workers' organisations internationally. And I was involved with that group. And because I had connections with some of the countries that were called communist, and I didn't believe they were communist. So so those of us who believed that sort of thing thought that they would, just as in 1968 in Czechoslovakia or in a number of other countries, there was a democratic tendency emerged in those countries. So one aspect is people who are opposed to capitalism, which I've always been, but the other aspect is in those countries where they were called communist or called socialist, what would the trajectory be in those countries? Where would they go when unrest breaks out or when internal crises break out? And that became a major focus of my life. And I moved to West Berlin in 1988 after having worked a stint on the buses in London. And then I moved to West Berlin with the intention of trying to go into the East and trying to make contact with like-minded people in East Germany. So I used to travel across to East Berlin like 2-3 times a week. First of all, you could go, it was like Cinderella in those days. You could go in from 12 o'clock at night, you could go in and you could leave. You had to leave at 12 o'clock at night. And I used to just go around bars, cafes, things like that, start talking to people and try and find like-minded people. I did eventually meet in East Berlin many of the leading figures of the opposition in East Berlin. Some were party members, some were outside the what was called the Socialist Unity Party. It was the Communist Party, you would understand it as, but it was called the governing party, basically. And then we got involved at the university, set up a student council at the university. It was the first independent democratic organization in East Germany. We set that up it was about August or September 1989. And I went to the demonstrations in Leipzig in advance of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And we published a newspaper. We brought out a newspaper and a manifesto of our own, which was circulated on the large demonstration on the 4th of November 1989, which was at maybe a million strong in East Berlin. And the population was 2.2 million in East Berlin. So it was a huge demonstration. And that was the last gasp, actually, funnily enough, of the type of ideas that I advocated, because once the Berlin Wall was opened, the mood changed in quite a different direction, and the trajectory towards German unification and all that process took place. And when Germany reunified, I left East Germany and went to China. But there was an interlude when I was in West Berlin where I went to China as well. Yeah.
So what was it like under the Stasi in East Berlin and East
I've
Germany?
got a Stasi file for my sins. Well, at least they made one. But because I was foreign, I came under the surveillance of military intelligence. And military intelligence opened a record on me on I think it was the 9th of June or thereabouts, 1989. So it was before I actually moved to the East. I moved in the summer. I got a place at the university by bribing one of the officials at the university. And the Stasi was we all think about the Stasi as this scary creature. And once or twice I thought I was being followed by someone or something like that. Particularly when I went across the border once. I had some dodgy book on me. It was written by a member of the Central Committee at the time of the formation of East Germany, called Wolfgang Leonhardt, and he wrote a book called The Revolution, or Child of the Revolution, actually, the translation into English. And he eventually fled East Germany in 1949 or 48 to Yugoslavia. And then he wrote this book, which exposed their role during the Second World War, the role of the leadership and what the machinations they got up to, which as anti-communistic. So they were actually sort of hovering between nationalistic maneuvers, which he found ever more intolerable. When more he read, he was in the Comintern archives, so the Communist International Archives. He was an archivist there, and he went through the documents, and he kept coming across things that made him uneasy, made him spine chill, because positions would change according to bureaucratic interests. And then eventually in 1948, 49, he left. And when he left, so his book was one of the main books that was a sort of, could be considered to be very dangerous in East Germany. And publication was controlled by the state.
Because he was originally a member of the party at the start. Right, so he was a sort of Goldstein-like figure.
Yes, I mean, one of the key things that he wrote was that all the Western propaganda, because you must remember, West Berlin was the center of Western intelligence operations against the East.
But there was huge indoctrination in West Berlin, wasn't there? And especially and West Germany following the war.
Well, yes, but what I was going to say was that there was radio in American sector, radio in French sector, radio in British sector. There was a Radio Free America, all this sort of stuff, and all the Western television stations, all broadcast to East Germany. So East Germany, from the origin of television, and most people had a television by the late 1960s, people had access to all the Western information. So it's quite different from the other countries.
So the rest of them obviously would be far worse, whereas East Germany, it's, they had two streams of information.
They had two streams of information, but most people, I mean, they might watch Dallas or something like that, but most people didn't take the Western news too seriously, and it wasn't considered too much of a threat to them, to the regime or the state, because within their own parameters, they had their own mode of discussion and framework for what was right and wrong. And once you're outside of that right and wrong parameter, the Western media would be considered, they're tied in with the old Nazis and that sort of thing. Many people in West Germany were linked in with the Nazis. There were propaganda campaigns run by the Nazis. Many of the people who took over Western Germany were former Nazis, lower level officials, or even some quite high level officials. And so the East Germans made hay with that.
Because they wanted to keep the infrastructure going, because they needed people to run it. And that's why they brought in these Nazis. And it's dodgy deals. I mean, there should have been a clean sweep, because they talk about the sort of denazification process where they were going to de-radicalize people. But then they just promoted all of these Nazis through the ranks. And you even see it within France. You've got all of these... the ones who supported Pétain and Vichy France, all of these quislings, then get back into government, or they're still holding high position rather than just being executed for treason.
Yeah.
And so they were rewarded for their crimes.
Yeah, and the United States famously had this thing called the paperclip conspiracy, where they exported many of the most brutal figures in Nazi Germany to South America gave them new identities in order to get certain information out of them, you know. And in West Germany, there were key officials who were former Nazis, and so the East Germans made a lot of that because everyone had suffered during the war, and the consequence of that was that there was one language which the East Germans and the party would have its own language. So the party is a powerful apparatus out of the population. About 10% or more of the population, adult population, were members of the party. So actually, it was 1.8 million East Berliners, but about 2.2 million party members. So 2.2 million party members out of 17 million people. It's a lot of people. And it was said in those days that there were two places, like in the 1980s, late 80s, there were two places where people believed, and that was Moscow and Berlin. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, where people were real believers. And so the idea that I had, and that, you know, it existed in those countries, was that you would be able to reform those systems into something that isn't capitalist and isn't of the character of the regimes or governments that have been in those countries. So that was that gap, you know, the ideological gap.
So you wanted to be somewhere in the middle. Wouldn't that have presented the problem that you've got people who are committing these horrific crimes under the East German regime? Wouldn't that have the problem, if you're just reforming it, of not getting rid of those people or punishing them for their crimes?
Mm. I mean, horrific crimes, I think, is an exaggeration. East Germany was a state that was supposedly built on these alternative traditions. Living standards were quite high. Everyone had food, clothing, shelter. There was no unemployment. You didn't have to work all that hard either. You know, I knew people who worked 3-4 hours a week and they were perfectly well off. Rent was like 5% of your income. And if you didn't pay it for 10 years, nothing happened. So there's a flip side to this, you see. On the one side, you have the best phrase that was used was an authoritarian kindergarten. So you have a lot of economic freedoms that come from not having to be compelled to do things because of finance.
Because you're subsidized, essentially.
You're essentially subsidized. The state was subsidizing housing, healthcare, education, food, everything, basically. Transport, you got a little ticket out the machine and you stamped a little hole in it. And if you didn't buy the ticket, no one cared. You could pull out 1,000 tickets if you wanted to. There was no transport charge, you know, in fact. And the transport ran pretty much day and night. And entertainment, you know, there was a lot of entertainment, community life, and so on. But one of the aspects of that, and there was a joke made by an old East German joke, you know, what's the inevitable phase between capitalism and communism? Alcoholism, and there was a certain truth to that the availability of universal provision and universal welfare was one thing, and then the other side to it was a sort of, you don't criticize us, you don't make trouble,
because we take care of you.
Because we take care of you, and if you want to be critical minded and so on, they won't just come and arrest you. Maybe in the 1950s. Early 1950s, just after the war, when you could also be arrested supposedly for being a Nazi sympathizer or something like that. But by 1970s, particularly actually after the Berlin Wall was built, when they could say, oh, the problem's been solved. We've cut out the fascists, you know. And that's how they put it. Then, if you were critical minded, the first thing that would happen you wouldn't be arrested. You're either in your community or in your workplace or your college, someone senior who's a little bit liberal-minded as well would be put in charge of like convincing you.
Managing.
Yes, managing you. There is a lot of similarity with corporate management in the way they did these things. There is. And then they'd say to you, you know, would you like to, you know, I see you're very critically minded. Would you like to go into the arts and, you know, do and the opportunities were there for people to move from job to job. Every single factory, every single workplace had spaces free. So they could move you to a place to accommodate you, unless you were really critically minded. And if you're really critically minded, and in 1989, there were about 200 members of the opposition. So they were people who consciously took part in an opposition and in underground work seeking to transform the system, and with the intention of, and with the knowledge that they're being under surveillance, that they're under. Also, there was a guy I knew, Uwe Bastian. He was in charge of he was a similar ideological position to me, and he used to produce journals through the churches. The churches would always have a sort of cover that allow you to do a little bit of publication, maybe 200 journals you could publish. And he went to a conference in Prague of peaceniks, so alternative peaceniks, so against nuclear weapons in the East as well. So when he met up with them, it turned out when he got his Stasi files, they were this big. I saw his files this big, and they were.
Have you got your file at home?
No, I'll come on to that in a minute. But so he had these huge files like that, and it turned out that everyone he went to meet in Prague was an agent. So it was only him wasn't an agent, And one day he told me that after the Berlin Wall was removed and all that, there was a storming of the headquarters of the secret police, and he took the database of all the secret police. And one day I went to go and see him. That was 1991 or 92, and he's sitting there on his computer like that. I come in there and he goes, "Look, this is all of them. 90,000 workers for the secret police." And he had the names, addresses, all of them. Yeah. But then he went round. The main one who was watching him, he went round to his house, and he just stood there outside his house like that, And the guy came out and he goes, "What do you want? What do you want?" He goes, "Just to make you feel like I used to have to feel, But if you've seen the lives of others, there's quite a good representation there of the sort of split personality of these people. They weren't necessarily these totalitarian monsters out to break your legs or something. You know what I mean? It wasn't so much brutality. In fact, the regime collapsed so quickly in comparison with what we've experienced the last couple of years. What people confronted in 1989 was nothing. I mean, there was one demonstration on the 7th of October 1989. We marched up from Alexanderplatz to Prenzlauer Berg, a sort of workers' come alternative district near the wall. And the secret police thought we were going to march towards the wall, but actually no one wanted to march towards the wall. And then they stood there like this in rows, blocking the street. And a couple of the secret police slug out with sticks. But it was wild and uncoordinated, didn't know what they're doing, and it turned a bit chaotic. There were 1,000 people arrested that night. They were then released a bit later the next day, or so. A couple of people mistreated, released after that. And that was it. And there was a huge uproar about this. How can the people's police, and that's the key thing, how can the people's police attack the people? That's the difference. Here we know the police, or we should know. Obviously, people think the Met should do certain things, but I think the consciousness in those countries was much closer to that the people's police, the army, the police, they should serve the people. That's their official role, and all the management stuff is going on to control. Now you might, as I said, authoritarian kindergarten is a good description.
It is a very childlike mental state.
Yes.
Do you think that's what they're trying to push over here? They get us into this state. They've talked about universal basic income, this level of dependency, so that people feel so comfortable and sort of mollycoddled that they won't feel that they have to rebel, even though they've lost their agency in life.
I mean, just to come back on that, I mean, to say just a childlike state would be wrong. I mean, don't forget, these people, a lot of them, I remember going to meetings there. You meet these people with one arm missing. They've been in concentration camps. They'd fought. Many of them had worked in the underground under Hitler. They'd experienced Hitler's regime. That was the reason why they were self-satisfied with having done what they did. Of course, as the generations came on, past, that authority based on that began to wane. Just like in a way, I mean, strange comparison, but there is a comparison. The Israeli state now has no authority based on the Holocaust. But once upon a time, even only a few years ago, you could just wave out the Holocaust and everyone says, "Oh, yes, you're right. I can't criticize you." Well, so it was in East Germany. They said the Nazis, we fought the Nazis, we're an anti-Nazi state, and so on. And that authority was real. I mean, the leaders of East Germany had been in the underground, had been in concentration camps, had been, so it wasn't like there was no truth to what they were saying.
So it was a sort of not necessarily charismatic authority, but it was a sort of authority of the person, of the people and what they've been through, and against this outside force. So comparatively, they looked much better. They were the good guys.
I mean, it wasn't that everyone thought that, but certainly in East Germany, it was a significant number. It wasn't. Maybe it wasn't a majority all that often, but it was a functional majority. So the machinery of the state, the party, the ideas overall, I think were accepted by my aunt, for example. It's not my aunt, my ex-partner's mother. So she left to the West in 1986 or 7. And then after the wall came down, then she was over with us when the kids were born, and in the East, and having a chat with some people, some friends who were Christians. And then they were discussing, and then she said, "Oh, he's still a Marxist. He's still a communist." And then they were like horrified. And then she said, "Oh, don't you have any ideas? I still believe in those things." So it was, a deep-rooted psychological thing that people believed in some egalitarian, not complete equality, but some egalitarian consciousness, looking after people, that type of idea, the socialistic consciousness. It was very deeply ingrained and produced by that system. On the other side, you had this petty administrative structures and, petty managerial structures that, you're perfectly legitimate to criticize. And people did. I mean, there was another aspect to that, which is you could remove those people above you. So you had power to remove, let's say someone's running this building here, and they're not doing it in a way that's keeps people in the building happy. You would be able to get that person removed. You kick up a bit of a stink, you complain to the right officials, that guy will fall, and they'll just be moved somewhere else. But in the West, it's very difficult to remove a manager at a workplace. You're going to take the chop first. So that balance of forces at the grassroots level produces an element of this. What you're talking about is a laziness that follows from having too much security, in inverted commas, and too much caring for you. It's like putting in the NHS and you stay in your bed, you know what I mean? That type of thing, yeah? So I'm not denying that exists, but I'm just trying to put it into the nuance of how people actually experienced it on the ground. It wasn't like they didn't experience, the secret police coming around to them, even if their neighbour was secret police.
How do you think it compares to now? I know that you've got wildly different situations in some ways, but if you had to make the call, which would you say was preferable?
I saw a picture the other day, someone posted of the Berlin Wall in West Berlin, and it was an area I used to walk along when the wall was there. And not just me, but a lot of people who lived in the East have enormous nostalgia for that time because life was different. And human beings behave like human beings. Now, the peculiarity of it is had you just gone across there from your normal life here, and I did that at the beginning when I first came over from West Berlin to East, it was a spine-chilling type feeling because I'd grown up on the Cold War stuff and the Berlin Wall and all this sort of stuff and life in the East, and it's all drab and all the rest of it. And so initially you begin to think only in the parameters of what you've been indoctrinated in since your childhood, all the television movies, all the spy things, all the rest of it. And then when you actually got to meet people on the ground, they were many, many times more human and friendly than they were in the West. So, and this was the same people, the West Germans and East Germans, just divided by a wall, So they were the same people. So that aspect of it, I think, is true, that life, human life was better there. I mean, human beings were more human. So, you got to put the nuance to it. On the other side, people wanted to travel, and they should have the right to travel, and there were many things wrong, and they should have had the right to correct those things. So that's where my sort of perspective came from, and still does, And over here, people imagine they're not spied on, but we're all spied on. Now it's the universe. And the East Germans, they had during the November 4th demonstration, one of the main banners that everyone came past, when everyone made their own banners on November the 4th, the big revolutionary demonstration. And on that demonstration, there was one banner said, "Everybody in the Stasi, everyone in the secret police." Then there'd be no secret police. So that was the kind of idea. But whereas now it's all the tech stuff, the tech surveillance and that sort of thing. That's the way the secret police operate nowadays, which eventually will be, or even is now already AI controlled and all that sort of thing. This ubiquitous methodology of segregating people off, of shadow banning them, of isolating them, and then only comes occasionally in most Western world, the stick on the whack on the head. That's only an occasional response, but normally the state will use these mechanisms of isolating you and preventing you getting anywhere near having a major voice in society. And those who do have a voice, it's all like, and that's what we saw in the pandemic. It all becomes one, all of them saying the same thing,
Exactly.
They're funny videos where they got you had that thing on that music video where they're
raw
all
milk
saying
conspiracy,
the same words.
yeah, misinformation whore.
That's happened, and but that's become a swarm. In East Germany, it was like, listen to this. So of course people learn, because there was only this. You learn to say, okay, what order are these words in, and that tells us what's happening. So if you knew criminology, you could read these German newspapers. They told you just almost as much as you could read in the West, but you had to know how to decipher the language they were using.
And so what they do is they cast out a sort of net, and the holes are pretty big, so you can slip through it, but you have to be determined to slip through the net. And what it will do is it will grab the sort of normie who doesn't think about things, and so they'll have that majority.
You mean in the East?
Yeah.
In the East, it was most people then basically left politics to the party, or the institutions of the party. There are various institutions. So you got youth organization, women's organization, but then they got factory committees and all this sort of thing. But there might be the factories would have a cinema in them, or would have a theatre troupe in them, would have a bar in them, would have accommodation associated with them. So you could get involved in those type of things at a minor level. You wanted to do something, but there wasn't per se so much of a private sphere. So this is the whole thing, that your private sphere was, you got a little dacha. Most people had a dacha. It's like a little garden house in the countryside somewhere, and they would go there, and that was their private sphere. Yeah, or they didn't. Most people didn't get involved in politics, so which is true in the West as well, But they didn't get involved in politics. And if you steered clear of politics, you weren't going to have any trouble.
So where do you see us going with this technology then? Because it brings to mind your stunt at Google HQ when they took down your YouTube channel. And I know now you're working with Subject Access. Yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about that, and also what you did at Facebook, talking about digital book burning, you called it?
Yeah, I mean, these are giant institutions, and they're like kings with no clothes, It's to say, had you gone into the party headquarters in East Germany and said something, of course, you wouldn't have got on YouTube or something like that. You would then you would have been nicked, yeah. But if you go to Google or Facebook or something like that, they are kings with no clothes. They don't actually have anything behind them. It's all it's all superficial, representing a large bloody room, bean bags, like cool image, all this sort of thing. But actually inside, there have been some protests recently about various things that have gone on. There was also the Cambridge Analytica protest, and various people at Facebook have protested about X, Y, and Z. But they can be exposed quite easily if the concentration is on them. But because their power is so ubiquitous and so universal, everyone's subordinate to them every day. Not many people go and do that. But last time I went there, so we did this one protest where me and Jim went down there, and I just give out some letters about them banning the YouTube channel, and then spoke very loudly because they got a big hall. It's very easy to speak loudly, and then bypassed the security, and the security didn't want to grab you because they know that, why should I jump on this guy? You know what I mean? And then they don't know what to do because it looks bad for them if they, if you bundle someone to ground and drag them out, it's not going to look good.
When all they're doing is reading a letter.
When all they're doing is reading a letter, which you've offered to give them anyway, and they've refused to take. So,
it's all because they wouldn't sign for it.
Exactly. And another time we went down, Andy Bridgen came down, and they. But before he got there, I went there I was standing there on my own. And they shut the building down when I was standing there, and these guys were going, "What are you doing? It's one guy. What you doing shutting it down?" They shut the whole bloody building. So if you had one person at the front, one person at the back, you can shut down Google.
The
It's
man
as
who
simple
shut
as
down
that.
Google is one man.
Well, you can do it. The point is that they're so paranoid, and I think that's the case with a lot of these high tech companies that are, that have got this enormous power. That actually, the people on the ground who represent this, they can't actually confront any serious arguments or discussion, nor do they engage in it.
So, do you think the way forward is targeting these tech companies themselves directly at their offices?
I mean, at their offices, I mean, it would last a while. I don't know how long you could keep doing that for without them responding in a way that would prevent that. But
Well, it's
but certainly, while you
protests.
can do it, I think it's a very good idea. And all these tech companies, I say, king with no clothes. You go to the building, it's just this appearance. It's like a hotel lobby. There's nothing really there, but it looks flashy, and it represents their power and their ease with which they maneuver. I mean, a nice protest now, I think, would be those people who were cut off YouTube for supposed medical misinformation, which has now been proven to be true. I looked the other day on YouTube, and in their terms and conditions and community guidelines, they've still got stuff that says anyone who says that vaccines do not prevent transmission is medical misinformation. Well, that's medical misinformation, and that's known to be medical misinformation now. So people would have an anger to do that, but. I mean, I definitely support that. Any protests at the big tech companies, I think, are very important, because these are the centers of world power now.
And we've seen with the Twitter files that at least some of the social media companies are collaborating with the US government, which is against their constitution. Obviously, we have a fundamental right. It may not be as specifically stated to free speech over here. Do you believe that the government over here is working with the social media companies to censor?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that. There's probably information about that to do with COVID itself, that they were doing that to put particular information out. It was the same with Cambridge Analytica. It was the same with Ed Snowden, the NSA PRISM program, where the big corporates collaborated with the intelligence agencies, and of course Julian Assange. They're all interconnected, aren't they? All the breaches of their information secrecy, and the state is working directly in conjunction with them. There's no doubt about it. It's in that way, it's become more and more like a sort of. I mean, I use the term carefully, because my terminology and the terminology that's widely used will be different. But what people called the communist regimes, the way that they had a single voice, if you like, to put out their message for the reasons I explained earlier on. Yeah, Pravda, or the East German Neues Deutschland, or even the Berliner Zeitung, all the newspapers in East Germany would come out with the same line, basically, and that was repeated in the coronavirus period, and it's being repeated to a large degree now as well with Ukraine and with Israel. A bit less with Israel, but it's still there, that they have this message to get. For example, Starmer. I mean, Starmer is a non-entity. You couldn't imagine I mean, he would be a non-entity in the lower managerial non-entity in East Germany. He would fit in well there. That's true. He would fit in well with that type of the lower level non-entity.
Sort of petty manager.
Yes, a petty manager, and yet he's been unendingly promoted since the fall of Corbyn.
Well, he went after Assange, and that's how he got his knighthood.
Yeah,
as head of the CPS.
Yeah, but the newspapers and the media have said not. Laura Kuenssberg and all these people who were going through the jugular. Every single sentence that Jeremy Corbyn came out with, whether you agree with them or not, is irrelevant. They're on his throat. As soon as he was gone, oh, Keir Starmer this, Keir Starmer that. Oh, he doesn't have any program. He still doesn't have any program.
What it is it's media curation. I mean, one of the it wasn't that remarkable, but historically it would be remarkable the way that they toppled Liz Truss, because Liz Truss, well, she deserves to be locked up, frankly. She was part of all of the collaboration with the Tories and their lockdown, and the part of the Uni Party. She was part of it. I believe she was a minister, which means she's part of CCR. As far as I'm concerned, she needs to be locked up, if not executed, for her crimes. Fair trial, of course. Fair trial. I believe in a right to a fair trial, but that's my opinion, and we shall see in court one day, hopefully. However, her measures were the mildest, weakest, wettest measures that you could get while still claiming to be some sort of older Tory who wanted lower taxes. And she proposed the most half-hearted tax cuts in history, and they destroyed her.
Well, that's right. I mean, she was elected. I said at that time, like her or not, she was elected. Whereas Rishi Sunak was not, and he came out. The man who lost got put in. So that shows the power of the City of London and of the elite who basically don't allow people to move beyond their agenda, and that's the game. Keir Starmer has been promoted to be exactly that person. He's been massaged into a position where they say, here's the man that's going to run the country, and it was quite clear from the moment they got rid of Corbyn that was the game. Put him in. Unless they could remold the Tories.
Well, I think they've done that. I think they've got both parties now.
Yeah, they've definitely got both parties.
And if you look at the way that Sunak called the election, there are all the rumours, and there seems to be some confirmation that a lot of letters were going into the 1922 committee. That's the committee of backbench MPs, which then calls the leadership elections. So they could have kicked out Sunak and called a leadership election.
Yeah.
Well, there is no 1922 committee if there are no backbench MPs, because there are no MPs if there's no parliament, because it's been prorogued.
Yeah.
Because there's a general election.
I mean, I saw yesterday there was talk they were still trying to do this, but that was dropped, and I think they would be forced to drop it, because otherwise it would be this whole constitutional issue. The King's already said, and
Not my king.
Yeah, not anyone's king.
I don't bow to traitors.
Yeah.
I've got to say, also comes to mind is our little tour of Pfizer, because you talked about going to the Google HQ and seeing nothing there.
Yeah, we went down to Pfizer headquarters. We did a scout mission in advance and found there was wires all the way around it. And then Ewan Media, what's his name?
Owen, Media Consumer.
Owen, Media Consumer, went down there, and they pretended that we were representing a business to rent property inside the building, because
an entire wing of the building.
And they advertised that there was property in the building. It was a huge building, and so they were renting out space in the building. So we went to go and take a look on behalf of some corporate which didn't exist. Certainly wasn't interested. And the estate agent.
A briefcase. You brought a briefcase. I'm sorry, Heiko, but it was
the Financial Times.
It was like a sort of 1980s version of what a left-winger thinks that a businessman is.
Well, what it is, my brother was in business, and my brother always used to, whenever he was going out for his business meetings, he always used to take a briefcase. And it's true.
Decade?
I remember briefcases. My dad had a briefcase. That was the thing. He used to run off with a briefcase, and everyone at Worcester Park Station, when I was a kid, they would all have a briefcase. In fact, they still had briefcase, umbrella, and bucket bowler hat in those days.
I'm glad you didn't.
I didn't bring the bowler. Yeah. But briefcase. So my brother used to slick his hair and go out. He did like a work agency. What do you call it? Employment agency. He was buying up employment agencies, like. And he used to wander off and slick his hair back and go off with a briefcase like that. So I thought it looked appropriate. Yeah, maybe you're right. Yeah.
Well, to be fair, we got away with it.
Yeah, we got in. I had a jacket on. Although I noticed there were holes in. I kept holding my arm.
Oh my god! Yeah, there were bloody holes in your jacket. The suit was probably a decade old.
Well, I bought it second hand on the market. Yeah.
Oh my god!
Yeah.
Wearing those muzzles was horrible, but it was
Muzzles. We had to
undercover.
wear muzzles to go in to abide by their regulations. Mind you, they've still got a sheet somewhere showing, giving us a sheet, like Pfizer guest password for the internet, just so that we could stream. Yeah. And then they wandered around this big building. There was one, and they kept saying, "Oh, well, the estate agent didn't really know anything. We were shown around by this Pfizer guy, right?" And then we went into this one office, which was the Pfizer office. It was hard.
And was it
like
meant to be 2,000 people in there or something like
I think
that?
the total staff they got is about 2,000 or 1,005, something like that.
And we saw, was it maybe 20?
But there were only a handful there, yeah. But there was one office I remember, and it was like about the size of this room, really. And it was glass window. We were all shooting off in different directions, looking around at this room, and a large room. But within that, there was this one room with a large with glass window, and then there was a sign on the window that said drug safety. And it was just a printout, an A4 printout, drug safety. So there's one guy in this place like in charge of drug. It looked so bad. Drug safety, one guy, like, an Indian guy on a computer, and that was it. And then and the rest of the building they took us around, it was a shell basically. There wasn't nobody doing anything there really. They had a sports thing, didn't they? Remember the sports thing? Nothing in there. Nobody's used it for ages.
And the thing is, if people had dissenting opinions, because this was the take that we had, if people had dissenting opinions, they're all isolated, and they
Exactly.
all and they revealed to us they all had work phones, and they had these mobile hotspot things around the place, and they all had to be on the same mobile network.
Yeah.
Meaning that if you're going to try and contact someone, it would usually be on your work phone or your work email, because you couldn't just walk up to someone and say,
"Yeah,
Steve,
yeah, what about this?" Exactly.
Oh, yeah,
exactly.
You would have to send them some sort of covert message saying, Steve, can you send me your personal number? And the minute you send that, you're worried, because what if he then reports you?
Yeah.
So you've got this whole thing where you can be surveilled.
Yeah.
Right? Oh, you're asking for people's personal numbers remotely. Isn't that a little bit dodgy? And I think we would have seen a lot more whistleblowers if people had been at work.
Probably. Yeah. Almost definitely. Yeah. I mean, when I scouted the place out a couple of days before, and saw that there were these they had these surveillance cameras around everywhere, and quite heavy barbed wire around the outside of the building. It was quite wide land, and it did look like something out of one of the 1960s films, where like The Prisoner or something like that, where
except there was no big orb that came down to get us.
No, that's right, but there was a peculiar atmosphere. There's no doubt about it. Very strange, and particularly at the time we were there, peak pandemic madness. Again, just shows you things you can do if you just a bit creative about thinking about that. And I like to do that sort of thing, because if you minimum energy, maximum impact, the good things to do.
Where do you get your creativity from? Is it from Speaker's Corner? Because you've made some wonderful speeches.
I mean, Speaker's Corner makes you do things on the hoof. That's one thing. But I mean, different countries, different types of political activity, contact with people from many different countries who are doing different types of protests. And I've looked at the history of protests and that sort of thing, and different experiments that people have done and tried to tie that in. My mum was an artist, so I used to look at that. Like, she took me to the theatre when I was quite young. Bertolt Brecht stuff, I was always into that. So, that type of stuff, I like to do that. And I don't like to. I was in various political groups, and they always like to, sell a newspaper, talk to, recruit this person. Why are you doing it like that? Why do you want to just do everything just on a mechanistic pathway to development? Why don't you just jump over that and assume people think that, and then approach them like that and do something a bit more dramatic? I've always thought like that.
Humour gets.
But Speaker's Corner helps with that, because you are standing up on a platform and just standing up and having a rant. You're sticking your neck out, and so you're not so afraid of doing stuff. Then I think that's an important part.
Are you still doing oration classes or oratory classes? Does your office still stand to come, and anyone can turn up and you can train them?
Yeah, and in fact, probably I haven't seen how these Workers' Party people speak yet, but that might be a thing to do. Yeah, during the election campaign, it might be a thing to do. But I mean, I'm going to go out and do quite a traditional campaign, stand on the streets and speak. I'll try to use just my voice to speak. And
So
occasionally I'll use an amplifier because I think people do like that. So that when John Major stood in the election, what was that, 92,
soapbox in
the
Speaker's Corner.
soapbox, he had the soapbox. He went to Brixton, he stood
Oh,
in the
it's
soapbox.
Brixton.
Everyone
Because he
shouted
was
at
from
him.
Brixton, wasn't he?
Yeah, he got heckled and stuff, but it was the image he wanted to present.
Hmm.
A man who can go on the street and not be bothered by being heckled.
Yeah.
And I think that's, if I go and do that, I think that will have a certain, I don't know whether I'll do how well I'll do, but it'll have a certain impact.
So in terms of what you're standing for, can I quickly run through some basic rights? Free speech. I take it you're in favour of free speech. Will that include abolishing the Equalities Act and also the concept of hate crime? Because the Equalities Act and this concept of hate crime. Firstly, hate crime charges people with a second offence.
Yeah.
So, for example, someone punches me in the face for
But,
my skin
black
colour,
colour,
as
yeah.
opposed to my shoes.
Yeah.
Why should they be charged with something secondarily? If they punch me in the face, they punch me in the face. That's the end of it. It's crime. It's intentional.
I'll abdicate responsibility, although I understand it's an important issue, but not having spent a lot of time thinking about it, specifics of the idea of hate crime, I'm not gonna stick my neck out and say
It is an emotion. Hate crime it's literally thought crime, as in Orwell.
Yeah. But the specifics of what you're saying, you're coming to me with a proposition about one thing, and I haven't really looked into it, so I can't.
Okay.
I can't answer. I don't want to tell you, I stand for that.
Equalities Act, because the Equalities Act essentially sets up this idea of group rights. You have rights from being a group, rather than the fundamental right of each individual before the law. Where do you stand on that?
Again, I haven't looked into it. Sorry.
Okay.
So if I'd had a look at the Equality, I probably should have done, but I had a look at the Equalities Act, then I would be able to comment more precisely. Give me more precise examples.
Okay.
And I could give you my point of view about it. But in general, I just stand for almost unimpinged free speech.
What about the right to bear arms?
Personally, I believe that the right to bear arms should be a constitutional right. But it should be a constitutional right within certain circumstances. I'm not advocating like the American right to bear arms. I don't really agree with that, because I don't believe that the individual ownership of weapons will serve society well. I think that the collective control over weapons is the key thing, rather than the individual ownership of weapons.
But how can you have collective control? At the end of the day, you need to have, in order to defend yourself, you need to have your own weapon, especially if you're disabled. If you're disabled, if you're weaker, and you can't defend yourself, why can't you have these weapons? It's robbing people who are weaker and more vulnerable of their self-defense, and it's particularly robbing opponents of the government of their right to self-defense. And I think that everyone has a right to own something. It's a possession. It's a piece of property. When they commit a crime with that thing, when they harm someone, when they cause some sort of loss or injury, that's where a crime is committed. I don't believe, I'm with William Blackstone, I don't believe property in itself can be a crime.
The ownership of weaponry, I would think, would be, I'm more in favor of a militia system than a standing army. So the militia system connects together the people with the weapons, rather than having a separate group with the weapons controlling society, or being able to be used against society. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm saying a militia system where the collective, where the people have either some training weaponry, or, for example, in East Germany, this guy Uwe Bastian I was talking about, we had a long discussion about it once, about reform of the conscription system in East Germany, because there was universal conscription there. So we both discussed it out and put forward the idea, or we both came to the agreement that the best idea would be for some kind of relatively regular training, a bit like in Switzerland they have relatively regular military training.
I'm in favour of
people have access to weaponry associated with that role, if you like.
I'm in favour of training, but the thing is, that if it were tied to some sort of government scheme, if the government were the arbitrator, if they were the umpire, we would end up in a scenario where we would be the first two people to have our guns taken away, right? Or our permits taken away. And I just think the idea, I've got my crossbows at home. The government, I don't believe I'm committing a crime by having them at home. I'm not harming anyone. Okay, right now it's okay. They want to ban them all. Well, they can come and claim them out of my cold dead hands, can't they? because I'm not harming anyone. I don't think you should be using violence against someone unless you're harming someone. But
Well, okay, but then there's the other side. Is if it's people have got submachine guns at home, and they're not harming anyone unless they go bananas and start submachine gunning people.
people
And
have got cars, vans, trucks. You can just plow them into a
okay,
crowd. But how often
happen.
does
It
that
does
happen?
in some parts of the world. Not every part of the world has got weapons. Does that happen? So that's the caution I've got in relation to the universal individual right to bear arms. I think it's a collective, and that was the case in the Paris Commune. It was the case in discussions about revolutionary theory historically. So that's where I'm coming from, and that's the type of position I take. Training, access to weaponry for the people. And you say it's the government. Well, the government is supposed to be in those circumstances representation of the people rather than separate from the people.
Well, I think we should always design our systems of government presuming that government is going to be the enemy of the people, because then you've prepared for the worst rather than just hoping for the best. What about freedom consciousness? So the ability to not just conscience but consciousness, the ability to take and own different drugs.
I don't have a problem with that. Having said that, again, the scale or the scope for the manipulation of drugs nowadays, and the fentanyl epidemic and all this sort of thing is a serious problem, and it does have to be somehow controlled. So, with the proviso, what we normally term recreational drugs, I don't have a problem with that. But when you see these people completely ruined by fentanyl and stuff like that, then of course you'd have to take some action against that.
Okay, Heiko, I'm sorry that we've got to wrap up here because we're running out of time in the room.
No,
can you let people know where to find out more about you and your campaign, and also obviously you're collaborating with Subject Access?
Yeah, go to Subject Access YouTube channel, the blue one. I'll be posting stuff about the campaign on there, and possibly on other places as well, but I haven't sorted that out yet. On the Workers' Party of Britain website.
Beautiful. Thanks for watching. Please give us a like, a share, a subscribe, hit the notification button if you would like to help. We've got a Patreon and a Subscribe Star, so please head on over there and pledge us some support if you want to keep this journalism going. We've got a professional studio here, and we could do with your support to keep these great conversations coming.